Racist cop drags a paralyzed elderly black man without knowing that his brother was a soldier. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing news stories here. Thomas had the signs of time and battle on his face. At 68, Thomas lived in Detroit, where the northern cold was less intense than his past memory. 20 years ago, after a car accident, he lost the movement in his legs and had to use a wheelchair to get around. Every morning, Thomas went out to the central square, a ritual he considered his way of staying connected to the world. One day, he crossed the square in his wheelchair, moving the wheels slowly with the strength of his calloused arms. The square was his refuge, a space to connect with the world, but also a daily duel against the invisible barriers of society. He stopped when he reached the crossroads that led to the other part of the square. A police car was poorly parked on the wheelchair ramp, occupying a space that should symbolize accessibility. Thomas inhaled. Although it wasn't the first time he had experienced this, each situation made him more indignant. He was patient, but he had a limit. Thomas knew he wouldn't remain silent. "This is absurd!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "How can a police car, which is supposed to set an example, be stopped here?" Some people stopped and watched, but no one intervened. Several looked away, choosing not to get involved. Thomas noticed, but didn't let himself be intimidated. He moved his chair closer and shouted again, louder, "Take this car away. It's disrespectful. It's absurd." The door of the police car opened, and two policemen got out, with expressions of irritation and arrogance. One of them, strong and tall, seemed to be the chief. His name was Stephen, which Thomas would find out later. He walked up to Thomas with a defiant look on his face, clearly disdaining the man in the wheelchair. "Listen, man," said Stephen sarcastically. "You don't know who you're talking to. Value the police." Thomas raised his chin, showing no fear. "Respect the police?" he retorted indignantly. "Respect the law. You're invading someone else's space. This is for people in wheelchairs, for people like me with no other way through." Stephen laughed scornfully, while the other policeman just watched in silence. Thomas got angrier. It wasn't just about the ramp or the car. It was about years of neglect, invisibility, and being considered irrelevant. "Listen," said Stephen, leaning over to look at Thomas closely. "You'd better keep quiet before you get into trouble." Thomas stood his ground. He never backed down from an injustice. "I know my rights," he said in a firm voice. "You can't threaten me. You're wrong, and I'm going to shout until someone listens." Thomas shouted, his voice echoing like a cry of resistance. Curious, a few people approached, but no one intervened. Stephen, clearly annoyed, ran out of patience. He approached, looking at Thomas as if he were a minor inconvenience. "I warned you," he said through clenched teeth. "Hold still!" Stephen gave Thomas's wheelchair a brutal and unexpected kick. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Thomas felt the floor disappear as his chair fell. The impact was brutal. The sound of bones hitting concrete broke the silence of the square. He fell sideways, his arm and shoulder cushioning his fall. The pain came like an intense wave, but not as powerful as the indignation burning in his chest. "Are you crazy?" he shouted, his voice shaking with pain and anger. Stephen made no reply. He looked coldly at Thomas, while some of the people around him began to murmur in surprise. The other policeman, silent, didn't intervene. Thomas, on the ground, stared at them with eyes burning with anger. "You're supposed to protect people," he said, his voice weak with pain but determined. "You are the criminals." But his words didn't touch them. Stephen and the policeman walked away, leaving Thomas wounded and humiliated. The square, once a place of connection, was now the scene of violence and neglect. Thomas once again felt the weight of being ignored in a society that avoided acknowledging its shortcomings. Stephen walked away, adjusting his belt as if nothing had happened. Thomas, wounded, tried to move, but the pain paralyzed him. He looked at the policeman and saw the younger officer hesitate. His conscience bothered the younger man, but Stephen's authority held him back. "You're cowards," said Thomas, his voice filled with anger and pain. "You kick an old man to the ground? Is that what you call serving and protecting?" Stephen turned quickly, his eyes blazing with irritation and contempt. "Shut up, old man," he ordered in a deep voice. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" The policeman stepped forward as Thomas tried to stand up. He put his arm on the ground but had no strength. His head was spinning and his vision blurred. Blood ran down his wounded arm, staining the concrete. His sharp tongue wouldn't shut up. "I'm not going to stop," Thomas declared firmly, "because you're wrong. The world needs to know." Stephen clenched his fists, clearly losing emotional control. Thomas's presence challenged his authority, reminding him that his power was as fragile as his morals. He looked at the other policeman, hoping for support, and got complicit but clearly uncomfortable looks. "Ah, that's enough," said Stephen, pushing the wheelchair away, as if to erase the image of the fallen man. "If you don't know how to behave, we'll teach you." Before Thomas could reply, he felt the weight of Stephen's boot on him. The blow was less intense than the first, but the humiliation increased. The policeman's movement emanated cruelty, seeking not only to hurt Thomas physically, but also to annul his dignity and existence. Some people approached the square, attracted by the commotion. Indignation was muttered, but no one dared to intervene. Thomas noticed the reaction of the passers-by: surprise, fear, impotence. For him, these expressions perpetuated injustice, the conniving silence of a society that chose to ignore violence rather than confront it. "They're crazy," shouted Thomas, his voice shaking. "Do you think this is going to silence me?" Stephen bent down, his face close to Thomas. The smell of tobacco and arrogance mixed with the cold air. "You talk too much," he whispered. "And in my world, if you talk too much, you hurt yourself." At that moment, Thomas received one last kick in the abdomen. The pain was intense, and the world around him began to darken. He fought against fainting, but exhaustion overwhelmed him. Before he passed out, he heard voices around him, some protesting and others just watching, but nothing stopped them. When he woke up, he was in a hospital. The white lights on the ceiling dazzled him, and pain pulsed through his body. He hardly had time to get his bearings before he was told that, after treatment, he would be taken to the police station. The charge? Social disorder. Thomas wanted to laugh, but even that caused pain. That's how the system worked. He was the victim, but treated as the culprit. As he was taken in a rusty wheelchair to the police station, he noticed the looks on the faces of the hospital staff. Most of them avoided looking. A young, bright-eyed nurse looked at him with pity and indignation. "This is wrong," she whispered, before being shushed by a policeman. The police station was cold and impersonal, reflecting the system that worked there. As Thomas was placed in a cell, he felt the weight of what had happened. Not just the physical weight, but also the psychological one. It seemed that the whole world had decided that he didn't matter. His words, rights and life could be crushed by boots and silenced by concrete. When the cell door opened, he looked up with difficulty. A policeman entered, but it wasn't him. It was an elderly man with a neutral expression. He had a clipboard, but didn't ask any questions or comment on Thomas's situation. He just told him to sign a document. Thomas saw that the paper was a public disorder report. He let out a dry laugh that resonated in the cell. "You guys are incredible," he said, his voice weak and hoarse. "You assault a man, break his bones, and still claim that I caused the mess." The policeman remained silent. He pushed the clipboard towards you impatiently. Thomas didn't sign it. He knew that any signature could be used against him, and he no longer trusted anything there. The policeman left without insisting, but gave him a warning look. Thomas was alone again. George, a general respected by his subordinates and feared by his enemies, was fighting his internal battle, marked by past decisions and broken promises. While he was making coffee, the phone rang. George answered without thinking, expecting an ordinary call, possibly from an officer requesting his presence. The voice on the other end of the line was tense and nervous. "General Jorge, it's me, Miguel, a friend of your brother Thomas. I didn't know who else to ask for help. Something horrible has happened." The name Thomas set off a trigger. George left his coffee mug on the counter abruptly, and the hot liquid spilled out without him noticing. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice as sharp as a blade. Miguel hesitated, trying to find the courage to continue. Your brother. He was arrested. Before that, George was beaten up by the police. I was in the square and I saw everything. They kicked his wheelchair, hurt him, and now he's in the police station. George's world stopped momentarily. Miguel's words echoed like thunder in his head. He tried to understand what he had heard, but only felt an intense anger rising in his body. He knew Thomas's strength and determination. He knew that if his brother had been confronted like this, it was because he had raised his voice against an injustice. "Where is he?" asked George, his voice tense and full of restrained fury. "At the Detroit police station," said Miguel. "But, George, they didn't just arrest him. They made him look like he was responsible for the mess. No one is helping." George remained silent. The call ended, but Miguel's words kept hammering away in his mind. He knew he couldn't disregard them. Thomas was more than a brother. He was his support, the person who always reminded him of his origins and reasons for fighting. It wasn't feasible to ignore that. Still in his uniform, George went to his home office and started gathering information. He was more than a general. He was a strategist. He knew he had to understand his surroundings before he could act. Within minutes, he had located the police station where Thomas was being held. His indignation was intense, an energy he would convert into action. As he got into the car, George realized the responsibility on his back. It wasn't just about Thomas, but about what his brother symbolized. Thomas had always been the voice of reason, a pacifist who fought with words, not weapons. George, on the other hand, was someone who imposed his will with force. At that moment, he knew he had to use everything to right the injustice. The trip to Detroit was long, but George didn't even notice the time. His mind was centered, his heart felt overwhelmed. He remembered Thomas from the last time they met. During a family reunion, Thomas had commented on the difficulties of wheelchair users and the lack of respect and accessibility. George just listened in silence, believing that these problems didn't affect him. Now it was personal. It was a question of dignity. When he arrived at the police station, the image of the cold building increased his anger. He entered with firm steps, his eyes shining with determination. George went to the counter where a stout, grey-haired sergeant was sitting behind papers. The sergeant didn't look at George as he approached. It was a mistake. "Nay, I want to speak to the person in charge of the police station," said George in an authoritative voice. The sergeant glanced disinterestedly at George's uniform before replying with contempt. "And who are you to demand that?" George leaned over the counter, shortening the distance. His voice didn't need to be louder. His tone was enough to chill anyone. "I'm George Salgado, General in the U.S. Army. I am the brother of Thomas Salgado, the man you beat, humiliated, and unjustly imprisoned. I repeat, call the person in charge of the police station. Right now." The sergeant hesitated, but George's authority intimidated him. He whispered into his radio and asked the station commander to go to reception. Shortly afterwards, a tall man with a messy suit and a harsh expression appeared. The captain led the unit, but his attitude seemed more focused on protecting his men than seeking justice. "I'm Captain Wallace. How can I help?" he asked, in a superficially courteous manner. George took a deep breath before answering in a controlled but tense tone. "Why was my brother assaulted by police officers while protesting against a police car on a wheelchair ramp? Why is the victim seen as a criminal while the aggressors go free?" Wallace crossed his arms, watching George as if to gauge his determination. He tried to turn away for a moment. "General, I think there's been a mistake. We're investigating the case," and George interrupted him. His voice, now stronger, pierced the air like a knife. "Misunderstanding. My brother has fractured bones and kick marks. Do you consider that a misunderstanding? I know his story. I know what happened. If you think I'm going to accept meaningless apologies or promises to investigate, you're very wrong." The tension in the room was evident. Other policemen approached, attracted by the conversation. George, in his grandeur, didn't seem to notice. He looked at the captain with a firm gaze. "I want the names of the officers involved," George continued with authority. "I want to know who was in charge of the shift at the time. I want to understand why my brother is still in prison and they are free." Wallace tried to resume the conversation, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence. "General, I understand your frustration, but we have to follow procedure. I suggest you call a lawyer and—" "I've already hired a lawyer," George interrupted. "Ubadudi, if you think this is just a conversation, you're very wrong. I came as a brother, but I can return as a senior army officer. You don't want to see the repercussions of this. I won't just release my brother. I'm going to reveal the corruption of this police station to anyone who will listen." George threatened, making Wallace hesitate. He knew he was dealing with someone unbreakable. The captain shook his head and tried to soften his tone. "General, I'm going to check the reports and the situation. Please be patient." George didn't answer right away. He crossed his arms, waiting. He knew he had won the first battle, but he didn't see it as a victory. As Wallace disappeared into a back room, George observed the looks on the policemen's faces. Some were defiant, while others looked fearful. He knew that fear was a powerful weapon. When he returned, Wallace stood with a stack of papers and a cautious expression. "We are investigating the case of Officer Stephen and 2 other police officers present at the scene. They will be removed during our internal review," he said, trying to be conciliatory. George stepped forward, his shadow casting over the captain. "It's a start. Don't think I'm going to stop. I want Thomas out of the cell today. I'm going to make sure that everyone responsible for this abuse bears the consequences." After hours of confrontations and negotiations, there was confirmation. Thomas would be released. The decision, forced by George's presence and the threat of exposure, seemed more like a political concession than an act of justice. For George, it was just the first of several steps. When the cell door opened, Thomas was sitting up, his face still scarred with pain. He looked at George, and for a moment the brothers stared at each other in silence. The exchange of glances was powerful, a recognition of the struggle they were both facing, albeit in different ways. George stepped forward and held out his hand, helping Thomas to his feet. The older man leaned on his brother, tired, but with his head held high. "You did this for me, didn't you?" Thomas asked, hoarse but grateful. "I'll do more if I have to," said George firmly. "This isn't over, brother. We're just getting started." The 2 of them went together to the counter, where Thomas signed the documents with difficulty because of his broken arm. George watched intently, as if looking for signs of a possible attack on them. The policemen now avoided the general, busying themselves at their desks or pretending not to see him. As they left the police station, the night air eased a little of the weight on Thomas's shoulders. George still wore the tension like a second skin. He helped his brother into the wheelchair they had brought and knelt down in front of him, placing a hand on Thomas's knee. "Tell me everything, Thomas," said George seriously. "Every detail. We mustn't let these cowards get away." Thomas sighed, trying to hold back the tears in his eyes. He recounted everything that had happened since he saw the police car blocking the ramp. He spoke with physical and emotional pain, but omitted nothing. He mentioned the shouts, the indifferent looks, Stephen's insults, and the violence that knocked him down. "They didn't just hurt me, George," said Thomas, his voice shaking. "They tried to eliminate me, reduce me to zero, as if my life had no value." George closed his eyes, reflecting on the words. His anger was rising like wildfire, but he knew he had to concentrate. His anger wouldn't help Thomas. His strategy could change the situation. "It won't stay like this," George promised, holding his brother's hand. "I got your freedom, but now I'm going after them. I'll bring each of these monsters to justice. They will bear the consequences of what they did to you." Thomas looked at George, his eyes reflecting hope and weariness. "I want justice, George," he said. "I don't want you to lose this battle. Think before you act." George agreed, but knew that the promise would be difficult to keep. He helped Thomas into the rental car and adjusted his seatbelt, making sure that his injured arm wasn't pressed. The silence on the drive to Thomas's apartment was not uncomfortable. It was a silence full of understanding. When they arrived, George helped Thomas inside. The apartment was simple but organized, with decor that reflected his older brother's lifestyle. George settled him in an armchair and stood next to him, watching him. "Tomorrow I'm going to investigate these policemen," said George resolutely. "I have contacts in the army who will help me. I want information about Stephen and the others involved." Thomas nodded, feeling very tired. George noticed and took a firm hold of his shoulder. "Rest today," George said softly. "You're home. That's right." George started with the basics. He had learned from years of military service that in order to defeat an enemy, you had to know him well. The first piece of this puzzle was Stephen, the policeman who led the attack on Thomas. George contacted the army to obtain restricted but legal information on local police officers. Within a few hours, he had a detailed file on Stephen. Stephen had a complicated past. Despite the decorations and years of dedicated service on his official record, George noticed a hidden pattern: accusations of misconduct that had not been formalized, accusations of abuse of authority, intimidation, and in 2 cases, disproportionate violence. This disappeared in the final reports, covered up by complicit colleagues and superiors. George was furious when he read it. The system seemed designed to protect men like Stephen, ensuring that their violence had no consequences. He knew it was only the beginning. George deepened his investigation over the next few hours. Using army skills, he began to trace Stephen's personal and professional connections. He discovered that he had relationships with suspicious people, businessmen, politicians, and gang members. Stephen used his badge as protection while being instrumental in corrupt schemes. George continued. He investigated the other 2 policemen who took part in the attack. Both had similar but less apparent stories. Eric, a younger officer, seemed to be manipulated by Stephen, following orders without question. Mendez, a veteran, had internal records indicating a tendency towards violence, especially against minorities. The discoveries increased George's determination. He recorded everything, putting together a dossier to expose both the people and the system that kept them unpunished. Over the next few days, George decided to take his investigation further. He needed clear evidence, something that wasn't disposable. He contacted 2 longtime friends from the army, experts in intelligence and surveillance. With their help, he organized an undercover operation to monitor Stephen and his collaborators. The days of monitoring were enlightening. George learned that Stephen used to go to a bar in an outlying area notorious for attracting criminals. He came and went without a uniform, always at night, and rarely stayed for more than an hour. George noticed that the visits always took place after his shift, indicating that he used his position to facilitate illegal business. The rainy night brought the most revealing moment. George, in a discreet car near the bar, saw Stephen leave with 2 men. They were chatting animatedly, and Stephen gave one of them a large envelope. The transaction was quick, but George managed to capture it with his camera. He knew that those images were more than a clue, they were evidence. During the investigation, George sought allies for justice. He reached out to civil rights lawyers and local organizations to spread Thomas's story. His goal was not just to expose Stephen, but to bring about a greater change. He wanted everyone to know what had happened and for the guilty to be punished. George knew he was playing a risky game. He could see that every day Stephen began to suspect something. Subtle signs, such as the way he looked when he left the house and the change in his habits, showed that he was becoming more cautious. George knew he had to act soon, before Stephen could protect himself. By the end of the 2nd week of the investigation, George had enough material to make a strong case. There were photos, videos, and evidence linking Stephen to crimes, as well as testimonies from people who had seen his abuse. What to do with this information? George knew that relying on the system was dangerous. He needed a plan to ensure that the truth wasn't hidden. Looking at the dossier he had created, George felt both tired and hopeful. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time he felt he had the tools to fight. What had started out as personal revenge had become bigger. It wasn't just about Thomas, but also about those who suffered in silence under a failed system. George switched off his laptop and stood up. The cold night illuminated the small apartment with the lights of the city. He looked at Thomas, who was resting on the sofa with a serene expression, and whispered to himself, "They'll take the consequences, brother. I promise." George was sitting in a discreet car on the street in a residential neighborhood near Stephen's house. On the seat next to him, a folder of documents listed evidence, illegal transactions, gang ties, and statements about abuse. George wasn't there just to observe. He was prepared to act. In the house, the lights were on. George knew Stephen was at home because his surveillance over the previous weeks had recorded the policeman's every move. He knew her schedule, her routine, and her weaknesses. George wasn't alone. A few blocks away, 10 reliable military officers were waiting for his orders, ready to act if necessary. At first, George wanted to confront Stephen directly. He got out of the car, adjusted his coat in the cold wind, and walked to the door. Every step was planned, and his heart beat with the serenity of someone who has lived through more difficult times. He reached the door, took a breath, and rang the bell. The wait was short. Footsteps were heard and the door opened, revealing Stephen. The policeman was calm, wearing casual clothes and holding a beer. When he saw George, his face changed immediately. His carefree expression was replaced by surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" asked Stephen, irritated. George was direct. "You know why I'm here," he replied, calm but tense. "You assaulted my brother. You exaggerated the power you were supposed to use to protect others. Now, Stephen, you will bear the consequences." Stephen laughed, a short, bitter laugh, and left the house, closing the door. "Listen, General," he said sarcastically. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're entering dangerous territory. Why don't you go back and forget about it before you get hurt?" George stepped forward, invading Stephen's space. His eyes met the policeman's, and his voice echoed like thunder. "I've been hurt before. I've lost things unimaginable to you. And my brother. You hurt him in a way that no man should. I won't forget. I won't let you get away." Stephen tried to show confidence, but George's intensity unsettled him. He stepped back, but couldn't control his arrogance. "You're not my enemy," he said. "I'm in charge, and people like you can't act without evidence." George smiled, but not in a friendly way. It was the cold, calculated smile that precedes a storm. "I have proof," said George, taking a copy of the dossier he had prepared out of his pocket. He gave the envelope to Stephen, who opened it nervously. "Everything's right here. Your transactions, links to gangs and testimonies from people you've threatened. You're finished, Stephen." The policeman read the first few pages, and George's face drained of color. He knew he couldn't run away from that piece of evidence. Instead of backing down, Stephen acted unexpectedly. He threw the envelope on the floor and stepped forward to push George. "Do you think you can come to my house and threaten me?" shouted Stephen, enraged. "I don't fear you." George didn't back down. He used his military experience to avoid Stephen's attack and quickly pinned the policeman against the wall. Stephen tried to fight back, but George, stronger and with years of training, prevailed. "You should be afraid," George whispered, his voice low and threatening, "because I'm not here to have fun. I sought justice." Just then, they heard footsteps approaching. The reinforcements were the soldiers George had brought. They emerged silently, surrounding the house in a coordinated fashion. Stephen, seeing that he was at a disadvantage, stopped the fight. "This is illegal," he protested, glaring at the uniformed men. "You can't arrest me." "Right," George replied, releasing Stephen and staring at him. "Do you think you understand what the law is? You assaulted my brother, a defenseless man, and then mocked him. I'm here to make sure you face the consequences." The military arrested Stephen, who showed less confidence and more fear. He tried to argue and shout, but no one would listen. George told them to take him to a safe place, a cabin in Beech Forest, where he planned to confront Stephen directly before deciding on his next move. As the military convoy set off with Stephen in handcuffs, George paused for a moment, gazing at the deserted house. The battle wasn't over yet, he knew. This was the first blow in a war he wanted to win. He got into the car and saw, through the rearview mirror, the lights of Stephen's house going out. He was driven into the forest. The cabin in Beech Forest was surrounded by a disturbing silence. The branches of the trees moved with the wind, But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. Stephen was in the chair in the room, with his hands cuffed behind him and a defiant expression. He maintained a posture of superiority, as if he believed he could escape the fate George had set for him. George was standing next to Stephen, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the policeman. His posture was striking, but it wasn't just his body that filled the space. It was the energy of firmness that emanated from every gesture. The soldiers George had brought with him stood around the hut like silent shadows, ready to act. The silence lasted a tense moment until George finally spoke. "Do you know why you're here, Stephen?" he asked in a firm voice. Stephen didn't answer immediately. He looked at George and smiled, a smile that challenged his authority. "You consider yourself a hero, don't you?" said Stephen sarcastically. "Kidnapping me and putting on an act. You're not superior to me." George ignored Stephen's words. He could see that the policeman was trying to provoke him in order to gain control of the situation. Instead, he moved forward, shortening the distance between them. "The difference between us," George said coldly, "is that I'm here to right an injustice. You represent everything that is wrong with this system. You overstepped your power, hurt a vulnerable man, and believed you could get away with it. You're not going to run away, Stephen. Not on this occasion." Stephen smiled, but his smile was empty, without the confidence he was trying to show. "You can't arrest me," he said. "This is kidnapping, George. If you think you have the morals to discuss justice, you're wrong." George leaned towards Stephen, speaking in an almost whispered but intense tone. "Don't get moral," said George. "No, you lost that right by kicking my brother and laughing about it. I'm not here to take the law into my own hands. I'm here to make you feel, at least for a moment, the weight of the consequences." He took a few steps back, returned to a firm posture, and signaled to one of the soldiers on guard. The soldier handed over an envelope, which George opened slowly. Inside, evidence was gathered: photos, records, and testimonies. He placed the documents on the table next to Stephen. "Look at this," said George, pointing to the papers. "All your illegal transactions, gang connections, and abuses of power. Do you still think you're in control? No, you're not. I've given copies of this to people who can make your life difficult. Lawyers, civil rights organizations, journalists. If you leave here today, your career is over." Stephen looked at the papers, and his face began to lose color. He knew George wasn't lying. His arrogance prevented him from giving in. "What do you want from me?" asked Stephen, his voice low but full of resentment. "Money! A revelation! What will get me out of here?" George smiled for the first time that evening, but not in a friendly way. A wry, determined smile. "I want two things," he said. "First, I want you to pay the damages to my brother, $100,000, sent directly to him. It's not about assuaging his guilt, but ensuring that he has the resources he needs to recover, both physically and emotionally." Stephen laughed, but it was now a nervous laugh. "Do you think I have that kind of money?" he asked. "You do," said George. "I know about your business. I know how much you make from your plans. Don't lie to me." "And the second one?" asked Stephen, now clearly less sure. George leaned in again, staring into Stephen's eyes. "You'll give yourself up," he said. "You will confess what you did to Thomas and the other abuses. You will face the consequences of your actions. If you don't, Stephen, your life outside this cabin will be a nightmare. I'm not just talking about what I can do. I'm talking about the gangs, the rivals you've gathered over the years. I know how to let everyone know where you are." Stephen swallowed. The trust he had sought to maintain was crumbling. He knew George wasn't bluffing. His life would never be the same anyway. After a long silence, Stephen gave in. "All right," he said, his voice bitter. "I'll make the transfer. I surrender. You can't touch me anymore. Yes, it's over." George agreed, but his gaze indicated that it was only the beginning. He withdrew, allowing the military to get a cell phone for Stephen to transfer. As the policeman typed, George felt relief, but not satisfaction. The justice he wanted for Thomas was a long way off. It was just one step. After the transfer, Stephen looked at George, defeated. "Let me go now," he asked. George signaled to the military, who removed the handcuffs. Before releasing Stephen, George leaned over and whispered one last time, "You're available, but keep in mind, I'm watching. One mistake and I'll be back. Next time there will be no talking." When he got home, Stephen walked in and slammed the door, as if to distance himself from what had happened. He left his keys on the table and threw himself on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. The situation was oppressive. The transfer to Thomas and the promise of delivery were just demands that he had met in order to get out of the cabin alive. Now that he was alone, reality seemed different. "I'm not giving up without a fight," he muttered through clenched teeth. Stephen knew that George was dangerous. He wasn't just a brother seeking justice, but a military strategist with the resources and determination to destroy enemies. Stephen was not a man who gave in. He had spent years navigating the system, controlling people and situations to protect himself. A general, no matter how threatening, would not bring him down now. The first step was to reconnect with allies in the shadows. He picked up his cell phone, looked around, and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. A deep voice answered on the other end. "Stephen, I haven't heard your voice for a long time. What do you want?" Carlos was the head of a local gang with whom Stephen had close connections. They worked together on schemes, ensuring that the police ignored the gang's activities in exchange for a share of the profits. Stephen summarized what had happened, avoiding details that would show him to be weak, but indicating that he needed help. "Carlos, I need protection," Stephen said urgently. "And besides, I need resources to retaliate against a guy who wants to hurt me." Carlos laughed low and threateningly on the other end of the line. "You've got yourself into something serious, buddy. Everything has a cost. How much are you willing to pay?" "Whatever it takes," said Stephen with determination. "I just need people to sort it out. It's fast." Carlos agreed, and Stephen's plan began to take shape. He knew that George was fearsome, but also that no one was invincible. Over the next few days, Stephen organized a group of mercenaries and gangsters ready to help him. The aim was clear: to take revenge with all his might and make George and Thomas pay for their humiliation. He pretended to keep his promise to George. He contacted lawyers and began to draw up a supposed confession. He called local journalists, hinting that he was willing to tell his side of the story. To the outside world, it appeared that Stephen was following through on the deal. Behind this appearance, the real story unfolded. He investigated George, using contacts to find out where the general lived and his weak points. Stephen quickly found George's house in Texas, a symbol of George's comfortable life. While he felt cornered, Stephen organized his attack carefully. He knew he couldn't confront George directly. The general had resources and training that surpassed anything Stephen could muster. He chose an indirect approach, attacking what George loved most. A group of hooded men moved discreetly down the street. They wore dark clothes, blending their shadows into the night as they approached the house. Under Stephen's leadership, the objective was clear and severe: to ruin George's property and his sense of security. It was a planned attack to demonstrate that Stephen would do whatever it took to retaliate. The men were committed. They opened George's car, parked in the driveway. A henchman wearing gloves started the car and discreetly left the property. The car symbolized George's efforts and achievements, going beyond a material possession. Now it was part of Stephen's revenge plan. The other henchmen planned their next move. With gallons of gasoline, they spread the flammable liquid around the house, wetting the walls and the lawn. The intense smell of fuel dominated the air. But no one flinched. They were there to obey, and Stephen's revenge would accept no mistakes. When everything was ready, one of the men lit a match. The flame flickered for a moment before falling to the ground. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the gasoline, and in a few seconds, the flames reached the walls of the house. The darkness of the morning gave way to an orange glow, while the crackle of the flames broke the silence. George was the first to wake up. A strong smell woke him, and he opened his eyes. He got up quickly, feeling the heat and the sound of breaking glass. Stephanie, drowsy, began to realize what was happening. "George, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. George ran to the window and pulled back the curtain to see what looked like an inferno outside. The flames had consumed part of the balcony and were rapidly climbing up the walls. "Let's go," he said, pulling Stephanie out of bed. "We need to go." The couple ran down the corridor, avoiding the hottest spots. George covered Stephanie with a blanket to protect her from the sparks and heat as he led her to the front door. The fire was everywhere. They detoured to the back door, where George made way by kicking a piece of burning furniture that blocked the exit. As they reached the garden, George glanced back. The house he and Stephanie had painstakingly built was being consumed by fire. He felt both relief that they were alive and fury at the destruction he was seeing. Stephanie, trembling, hugged him as silent tears streamed down her face. Before George could understand what was happening, the sound of tires on the asphalt distracted him. He saw the stolen car on the road, driven by a henchman. The car disappeared into the darkness. But the message was clear. It wasn't an accident. It was an intentional attack. A few minutes later, George and Stephanie were recovering when the fire department arrived. George watched in silence as the professionals tried to control the flames, but he knew that little would be saved. When the fire was extinguished, all that remained of the house was a burnt-out skeleton, a sad reminder of the violence he and his family had suffered. George's phone then rang. He answered it, feeling a tightness in his chest, already anticipating who was on the other end. "George, I hope you enjoyed my present," said Stephen with sarcasm and satisfaction. "This is just the beginning. Messing with me has its consequences, and you and your brother are going to pay dearly." George held the phone tightly, feeling the blood boil in his veins. He wanted to shout at Stephen that this wouldn't destroy him, but he remained silent. The anger he felt was a weapon he knew he would need to handle carefully. After a while, he answered, his voice low and threatening. "You've made a serious mistake, Stephen," said George. "You think you can intimidate me, but you've given me more reason to take you down. I won't stop until I've eliminated you and everything you stand for." The call ended, but George's words continued to echo. He hugged Stephanie, who was still in shock. "I promise," he said firmly. "It won't end like this." Over the next few days, George planned his response. He knew he couldn't act without thinking. Stephen was intelligent, but George was more so. George went to the center of the plot and knelt down, touching the ashes. He noticed the roughness under his fingers, as if trying to grasp the importance of the moment. He remembered everything that had happened since the attack on Thomas. The humiliation of his brother, the investigation he had led, the confrontation with Stephen, and now this. The events connected, creating a causal sequence that had brought him here. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but intense, echoing in the cold air. "It won't be like this. I won't let you get away, Stephen. Not after everything you've done." George stood up slowly, straightening himself as if preparing for battle. He knew he had to act, but that he couldn't do it alone. Stephen had allies, resources, and protection that made him untouchable in the system. George would need strategy, precision, and trust in people, as well as brute force, to bring him down. He approached Stephanie, knelt down beside her, and held her hands. "Stephanie, I promise," he said, his voice tight and raspy. "I'll sort this out. I'll protect you and Thomas. I'll make sure he bears the consequences of what he's done." She looked at him for the first time after the fire, and he could see the fear and hope in her eyes. Stephanie trusted George not to make promises in vain, but she was aware that the path would be risky. "I want this to end, George," she said, her voice shaking. "I want our life back." George agreed. He couldn't guarantee that everything would be the same, but he promised to fight to the end so that Stephen wouldn't hurt anyone else. George began drawing up his plan that afternoon. He contacted his allies in the army, people who knew and trusted him. He called Miguel, Thomas's friend and a witness to the attack in the square, asking for help in getting more information. George knew he would need all the resources available to him. He stepped up security measures for Stephanie and Thomas. He found a safe place for the two of them to stay while he confronted Stephen, protected from retaliation. George considered his family's safety his top priority and was ready to give up everything for it. As he worked out the plan, George thought about what it meant for him. He was no longer just a brother seeking justice or a husband defending his wife. He was a man at war, a fight he hadn't chosen, but one he was determined to win. That night, watching the stars from the window where Stephanie was, George muttered, "You may have started this, Stephen, but I'm going to finish it." With that promise, George concentrated fully. A new blow surprised George. Thomas, in his wheelchair, was in the living room of the apartment watching the news on television. The scar from the police attack bothered him, but the greatest pain came from the humiliation. He tried to focus on the future, on George's support and the promise of justice, but the silence of that night seemed to have an inexplicable weight. Outside, danger was approaching. 3 hooded men in black walked silently down the empty street. They knew Thomas's movements, knew that he lived alone, and that his routine was constant. These men had been sent by Stephen, advancing his vendetta against George and his family. They forced the front door, and the latch gave way easily. Thomas turned quickly towards the entrance when he heard the sound, his heart racing. Before he could react, the men were already inside, their menacing silhouettes filling the room. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice firm but tense. The men remained silent. One of them advanced quickly with the wheelchair, while the others searched the apartment to make sure there was no one else. Thomas tried to push the chair hard, but his physical condition prevented him. He shouted, a sound that broke the night silence like an alarm. "Let me go!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty building. "You have no right to this." The men were stern. One of them bit Thomas's mouth, silencing his screams, while another tied him to the wheelchair with nylon straps. The third quickly signaled that it was time to go. They knew they wouldn't have much time before someone heard the sounds. The men took Thomas to a black van in an alleyway. They lifted the wheelchair and placed it in the vehicle, holding Thomas like a load. The elderly man tried to resist, but his strength was running out. He felt his anger and helplessness growing, but there was little he could do against the kidnappers. As the van sped through the dark streets, Thomas reflected on George. He knew that his brother would do everything possible to save him. He was his only hope at the moment, but he knew that Stephen was involved. This man's cruelty and cowardice were immense. The next morning, George received the dreaded call. The phone rang insistently, and he answered it quickly, feeling an inexplicable anxiety. A familiar, repulsive voice sounded on the other end of the line. "George, I hope you're all right because I have a surprise," said Stephen, laughing coldly. "Your brother, he's here. If you want to see him alive, you'll do as I say." George held the phone so tightly that his fingers began to ache. His breathing was labored, and the anger in his voice was intense. "If you hurt my brother, Stephen, I promise I'll get you," George replied menacingly. Stephen laughed again, a sound that seemed to be provocative. "Don't make me laugh, George. I know your skills and mine. You'll confess to a crime, something that will jeopardize your military career. A general accused of assaulting women? That's enough. You'll turn yourself in, leave the army, and disappear from my life. Otherwise, Thomas won't have a happy ending." George fell silent, fighting the urge to explode. He realized that Stephen was trying to manipulate and destroy him. George was not the type to give in easily. "I'm going to save my brother," he said, with a calm that was more threatening than his anger. "And in doing so, Stephen, there will be nothing left of you." Stephen, seeing that George would not give in easily, replied coldly, "Success, General. You'll need it." George stood with the phone in his hand for a moment after ending the call. He stared at Stephanie, who was watching him uneasily, and then at the folder with the files on Stephen that he had assembled. He knew he had to act soon. Thomas was at risk, and every second was crucial. George decided to act. A map of the United States with an area marked out lay on the central table. Men and women in military uniforms listened as George, fists on the table, described the plan. His eyes were on the map, but his mind was on Thomas, lost and in need of help. "We know that Stephen doesn't act alone," said George, with a firm voice and restrained emotion. "He has allies, and he will use them to protect his plan. We know that Thomas is still alive. Last night, I received a call from him and managed to trace his location in part. He's in the Oregon desert." The words floated for a moment. The Oregon desert was vast, a maze of barren land, rocks and ravines. Finding someone there would be like finding a needle in a haystack. George didn't shy away from challenges. He had a skilled team and a determination that would overcome any barrier. He faced the man next to him, the intelligence specialist Ramirez, who had collaborated with George on past missions. "Ramirez, we need to confirm the location," said George. "Use the trace from Stephen's last call. I want to compare it with satellite signals showing anomalous activity in the region." Ramirez agreed, typing commands into his laptop. George turned his attention to the others. "Let's treat this as a military operation. We can't jeopardize Thomas's life or allow Stephen to react. We need to act quickly and precisely." He indicated the access routes to the desert on the map. "The team will be divided into 3 groups. The first will carry out ground reconnaissance, exploring the main access routes. The second will use drones to keep an eye on remote locations inaccessible on foot. And the third will be my team. We'll go to the suspect point after confirming the location." As he spoke, the faces around them showed confidence and determination. They knew they were facing a dangerous enemy, but they trusted George and his leadership. "It's not just about saving Thomas," George continued, his voice low and intense. "It's about defeating Stephen and what he symbolizes. He attacked my family. He ruined our home. Now he's trying to use my brother in his dirty game. It ends here." The room was silent for a moment before Ramirez raised his head from his laptop. "Location confirmed," he said. "We have a set of coordinates. It seems to be a makeshift facility, perhaps a hut or a small hideout. It's in a remote area, about 80 kilometers from the nearest settlement." George agreed and started jotting down points on the map. "All right, everyone," he said, organizing the papers on the table. "I want everyone to be ready in 2 hours. We'll take the basics. No gaps, no doubts." The next few minutes were filled with preparations. George checked the plan, making sure that each member of the team understood their roles. He informed his wife, Stephanie, that she was safe as she left. The goodbyes were short, but emotional. The team left when they were ready. George, leading his group, felt the responsibility and strength of his mission. The next few hours were a race against time. They drove along empty roads, crossed tricky paths, and approached the shelter with care. As they neared the site, George ordered the drones to be launched. The flying machines monitored the area, transmitting live images to the team. Stephen's hideout appeared on the screen, a wooden hut surrounded by dry land and guarded by around 15 armed men. George watched the images carefully. He spotted Thomas's wheelchair in a corner of the room, seen through the window. His brother was present, but under constant supervision. George felt relief and anger. Stephen had crossed all boundaries. He turned to his team, his words sounding like an order. "Now we understand what we're up against. They are many but disorganized. We will attack on 3 fronts. My group will head for the hut, eliminating the nearby threats. The other 2 groups will protect our rear and block escapes." Everyone agreed, checking their weapons and equipment. George watched everyone, his eyes showing gratitude and determination. Thomas must be the priority. Make sure he stays alive. About Stephen, he stopped, showing anger. "I'll take care of him." George led his team to the hideout. Thomas's wooden hut appeared distant, small and fragile in the desert. George knew that the place was a makeshift fortress, protected by 15 armed men, ready to fight to the bitter end. He carefully analyzed the position of the guards, watching from the drones that flew over the area. "They're spread out," muttered Ramirez, the intelligence specialist next to George. "We have 2 at the entrance, 3 on the perimeter, and 5 in the hut. The others are nearby, probably monitoring escape routes." George agreed, staring at the target. He knew he couldn't miss. Thomas was there, and every second counted. "We've divided into 3 fronts," George said quietly, pointing at the digital map. "Group 1 advances from the rear, neutralizing the outer guards. Group 2 surrounds the perimeter to prevent escape. Group 3 enters through the main entrance. We rescue Thomas and confront Stephen." The faces around us were serious but resolute. Everyone in the team trusted George and didn't question his orders. They knew it wasn't just a mission. It was a fight for Thomas's life and the end of an unjust story. The operation began with clear orders. Group 1 advanced with precision, silently eliminating the guards on the perimeter. The sound of blows and falls was the only proof that something was happening. Group 2 moved into position, blocking the escape routes with weapons at the ready. George led his group to the main entrance, walking lightly on the dry ground. He ducked close to the door, hearing muffled voices from inside. He knew Stephen was there, probably surrounded by his cronies, but that didn't frighten him. He signaled to Ramirez, who was carrying an explosive, to open the door. The explosion was deafening, echoing in the desert. The door to the hut was smashed in, and George entered first, gun in hand. The hut was small and warm, with flickering light bulbs. The henchmen reacted quickly and drew their weapons, but George and his team were more agile. The next few seconds were organized chaos. George fired with precision, hitting 2 armed men before they could react. Ramirez protected his side while the rest of the team neutralized the last threats. Bullets whizzed and shouts along with the sound of breaking wood dominated the atmosphere. In the middle of the confusion, George saw Thomas. His brother was tied to a chair in a corner of the hut, his face marked by fatigue and pain. His eyes were alive, and when he saw George, something flashed in his expression, hope and relief. "Thomas!" called out George, running to him while Ramirez protected him. George cut Thomas's bonds with a knife from his belt and held his face carefully. "I'm there, brother. I'm going to get you out of here," he said with emotion. Before they left, a familiar voice echoed, "Take a good look, George. You're just in time for the final." It was Stephen. He was in the center of the room with a pistol in his hand and an icy smile. He looked sure of himself, as if he had been waiting for this moment. George positioned Thomas behind him and pointed the gun at Stephen. "Stop, Stephen," said George firmly. "Leave the gun and give yourself up. You can't escape." Stephen climbed into the car, started the engine and sped off, creating dust as he disappeared into the night. The sound of the engine alerted the soldiers, and an alarm went off. But it was too late. Stephen was many kilometers away before anyone could start a chase. Driving along, Stephen looked in the rearview mirror, smiling coldly. He knew he had narrowly escaped, but that George and his team would not give up easily. He had a plan. He had prepared an escape route by talking to criminals. What was the next destination? The Philippines, a place where he thought he could temporarily disappear and regain his strength. Stephen used a disposable phone hidden in his boot to contact his allies. He sent one of them to fetch a small, private plane from a nearby clandestine airstrip. Within a few hours, it left for the Philippines, leaving the Oregon desert and George's base. As the plane flew away, Stephen looked out of the window, focused on the horizon. "It's not over yet, George," he whispered to himself. "You won the battle, but not the war." He knew that in the Philippines he could use his connections to hide and plan his next move. However, he recognized that George was a determined man and that the dispute between them was far from over. Stephen wouldn't accept any losses. He was determined to change the situation, whatever the cost. At George's base, the general was meeting with the team to assess the situation. When he heard about Stephen's escape, his expression was unchanged. But internally, he felt frustration and renewed determination. "He may have escaped," said George, observing the faces of his allies, "but he won't get very far. We'll track him down. Next time, he won't be able to escape." Stephen rented a discreet house in an isolated area, surrounded by dense vegetation. He began to plan his life and possible revenge on George. He underestimated the determination and resources of the man who was chasing him. George didn't delay. When he heard that Stephen was going to the Philippines, he activated his network of military and intelligence contacts. He used tracking and data from allies to identify Stephen's clandestine flight and narrow down his location to an island. For George, it wasn't just justice but honor. Days later, George arrived in the Philippines with a small but skilled team. Each member was a combat and surveillance specialist chosen by George for the operation. He knew the location was distinctive. The dense vegetation and tropical climate could complicate the capture. George knew that the element of surprise was in his favor. As the team arrived at an isolated spot on the island, George met with Ramirez to discuss the plan. "We've confirmed where he is," said Ramirez, showing a map on his tablet. "He's in a house 2 kilometers from here, in a forested area. Surveillance has indicated that he is alone, but we must prepare for resistance." George agreed, looking at the map. He knew that Stephen was uncertain and that, even alone, he could be threatening. "We'll split up the team," said George firmly. "In 2 groups. The first will surround the area to prevent him from escaping again. The second will go in. I don't want to make another mistake." As the sun set, coloring the sky orange and gold, the operation began. George's group walked in silence through the forest, using the vegetation as shelter. Every step was measured, every sound muted. Stephen's house soon came into view. A simple building with wooden walls and a zinc roof. Dim lights in the windows showed that he was at home. George signaled for his team to get into position. Ramirez and 2 other soldiers surrounded the back of the house, while George and 2 others approached from the front. They waited, watching the movements in the house with night binoculars. Stephen seemed alone, sitting at the table with a drink. George raised his hand to signal the advance. A man used a tool to open the door silently. As the door opened, George entered first, gun in hand. Stephen, surprised, stood up quickly, knocking over his chair. "George," said Stephen, surprised and sarcastic, "I should have known you wouldn't give up." George had his gun aimed at Stephen, looking at the man who had brought him so much suffering. "You escaped once," said George firmly. "You won't do it again. It's over, Stephen." Stephen stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. George knew he didn't surrender easily. "Are you finished?" Stephen asked, smiling coldly. "George, you don't understand. Even if I fall, others will take my place. There will be no end to this." George kept his eyes open. He moved closer, shortening the distance, and his voice sounded like thunder. "Maybe others will take your place, but you'll never hurt anyone again, not as long as I can stop it." Before Stephen could reply, the others from the team entered the house and surrounded him. Stephen watched, realizing that he was at a dead end. He finally lowered his hands in resignation. "All right, George," he said dejectedly. "You've won." George didn't speak. On the boat, George gazed at the horizon as the sun set and the stars appeared. Stephen, handcuffed and silent, was under the surveillance of the soldiers. George knew that even under arrest, Stephen was still a threat. He knew that he would take every precaution to ensure that Stephen didn't escape again. As the boat sailed through the calm waters, George turned to Ramirez. "We're going to bring him to justice," he said, "and I want to make sure that wherever he goes, he doesn't have the chance to continue his destruction." After hours, when they docked at a military base, George called his team into a makeshift room. The space was small, with fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows on the concrete walls. Stephen was being held in a nearby cell, under surveillance. "We have a difficult choice," began George with determination. "We've caught Stephen, but he's more than a common criminal. He has connections, tools. He's escaped before, and we can't let it happen again." The team members stared at each other. Everyone understood what was at stake. Ramirez, the specialist, was the first to speak up. "If we hand Stephen over, he could escape, or, worse, continue acting even in prison. He's the kind of man who always finds a solution." George confirmed Ramirez's concerns. "We need to ensure his permanent neutralization," said George, with words that generated absolute silence in the room. A soldier called Lopez leaned forward, looking intensely at George. "What do you think, General?" he asked. George took a breath before answering. He knew his proposal was unusual, but it had to be done. I know a network of mercenaries who operate illegal prisons outside their usual jurisdiction. They have a facility in Ecuador for dangerous prisoners, no connection to the official system, no possibility of escape. The silence in the room was broken by murmurs. George's proposal was audacious, but it had risks. Ramirez, always acting as the conscience of the group, expressed concern. George, this goes beyond ordinary justice. This is a prison that operates outside the law. If this is revealed... George raised his hand and interrupted Ramirez. I'm aware of what's at stake, Ramirez. I recognize that this is not the best thing. Stephen is not the kind of man you can deal with idealistically. He's a tumor, and we need to remove him at once. I'm not asking you to agree with me completely. I'm asking you to trust me. I'm doing this not out of retaliation, but to defend those he can still hurt. The faces at the table expressed understanding and hesitation. In the end, everyone knew that George was right. Stephen was an undeniable threat. The team members agreed, showing support for the plan. The next morning, Stephen was taken away in a small plane under the supervision of George and 2 soldiers. The destination was an illegal airport in Ecuador, where George's contacts took care of the logistics. On the flight, Stephen remained silent, but his eyes observed everything around him, like a cornered animal looking for a way out. Upon landing on an isolated runway, George descended first, with firm steps. He was met by 2 serious men used to dealing with this. Victor, the leader of the mercenaries, was one of them. "Is this the man?" Victor asked, looking at Stephen with contempt. "Yes," said George. "I want him gone from now on. No contact with the outside world, no possibility of escape." Victor agreed with a neutral expression. "That can be solved," he said, signaling for his men to take Stephen. Stephen, seeing his chances running out, broke the silence. "Do you think that's going to beat me, George?" he said defiantly. "I always find a way back, all the time." George walked over to Stephen and looked into his eyes. "You could do this before," said George, his voice icy, "but not now. You won't hurt anyone else." Upon returning to the United States, George was briefly relieved that Stephen had been captured and neutralized. After weeks of fighting and difficult choices, he finally felt that his family was protected. This feeling was fleeting. The real battle wasn't over yet, and George was preparing for a loss that no amount of training or planning could help him cope with. Thomas was in hospital under intensive care. Despite the rescue, the days of captivity and the beatings he had suffered had left their marks on his body. He was strong spiritually, but his body no longer had the endurance it used to. George knew this, but refused to accept the possibility of losing his brother. For him, Thomas was the basis of his struggle, the reason he faced all the dangers. When he arrived at the hospital in the morning, George saw Stephanie in the waiting room, her hands in her lap and her eyes on the floor. She looked up when she saw George enter, but her expression showed concern. George approached her and touched her shoulder gently. "How does he look?" he asked in a low but urgent tone. Stephanie sighed, searching for the right words. "He's stable, but the situation is delicate, according to the doctors." "George, his body is tired. They're doing their best." George agreed, but he was already planning to make sure Thomas got the best treatment. Giving up was not an alternative for him. He entered Thomas's room, ready to encourage him and assure him that everything would be all right. When George saw Thomas on the bed, something snapped inside him. His brother, once strong, now looked frail, surrounded by machines that monitored his heart and breathing. His arm was still in a cast, and his face reflected his suffering. When Thomas opened his eyes and saw George, a small smile appeared on his lips. "George, you've arrived," said Thomas, his voice weak but grateful. George approached quickly, holding Thomas's hand tightly. "You've certainly arrived, brother. I'll always be here for you." For a few moments, the two talked about trivial matters. George told Thomas how Stephen had been captured and neutralized, assuring him that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. Thomas listened in silence, his eyes beaming with pride. "You kept your promises, George," said Thomas, squeezing his brother's hand. "You took care of our family. You've done justice." George shook his head, fighting back the emotion that wanted to explode. "But it's not over, Thomas. You're leaving. We're going to rebuild everything. The home, our existences. United." Thomas smiled again, but there was something in his gaze that George couldn't readily interpret. "George, you've always fought," said Thomas, his voice weaker. "Now you need to learn to live, fighting for yourself, only for others." The next morning, George received an emergency call from the hospital. He arrived quickly, his heart heavy from a feeling he didn't want to accept. When he entered the room, he saw the doctors trying to revive Thomas. The sound of the monitor, once steady, was now a constant alarm. "Thomas!" George called out, but was stopped by a nurse who grabbed him by the arm. The doctors rushed over, but after minutes, one of them denied it with his head. The monitor made a continuous sound that George would never forget. "I'm sorry," said the doctor, looking at George with pity. "We did our best." George felt as if the world had stopped. He approached the bed, observing Thomas, who seemed calm. He held his brother's warm hand and felt tears flow silently. George had always been a strong man, steadfast in the face of any challenge. At that moment he felt shattered. Stephanie entered the room and, seeing George next to Thomas's body, began to cry. They hugged, sharing the pain of an unbearable loss. George organized Thomas's funeral with respect and dignity. The ceremony took place in Detroit, with friends who admired Thomas's strength and character. George gave a speech in a firm, emotional voice. "Thomas was more than a brother," he said. "He was my mentor and inspiration. He showed me that fighting is about words and courage, not weapons. He never gave in, even when everything seemed to be against him. Now we must honor his legacy by continuing his fight for justice and dignity." After the ceremony, George stood by Thomas's grave. He touched the headstone, where the engraved words reflected his brother's spirit. "Justice comes with the end of silence." George inhaled deeply, feeling the pain of loss and a new determination. He knew that his battle was not yet over. He was determined to honor Thomas's memory by preventing others from going through what his brother had suffered. George stood alone in the living room, holding one of the few photos that had escaped the house fire. It was a picture of him and Thomas, taken years ago. Smiling, they were young and dreamy. George looked at the photo for a long time before speaking, as if he were addressing his brother. "You always said that people needed hope, Thomas," he said, his voice low and emotional. "And I've only just realized that. I promise I'll find a way to continue what you've started. I will not allow your voice to be silenced." The next morning, George began to draw up a plan, but now it was different. It wasn't a plan of attack or a combat strategy. It was a project to create something lasting that could influence the lives of others, as Thomas had always wanted. He began researching civil rights organizations, support groups for victims of police violence, and projects to increase accessibility for the disabled. With every page read, an idea jotted down, George felt a deep reconnection with Thomas. He founded an NGO in his brother's honor, focused on social justice, human rights, and equality. He named it Unbreakable Voices, representing the strength of Thomas and those who will not be silenced. As the days went by, George noticed his pain changing, finding a purpose rather than disappearing. He recognized that he would always miss Thomas, but he also understood that he could pay tribute to him by living according to his values. George reconnected with Stephanie, finding strength in their previously distant mutual support. One afternoon, in the NGO's makeshift office, Stephanie came in with 2 cups of coffee. She sat down next to George, looking at the papers on the table. "You're doing something amazing, George," she said, smiling. "Thomas would be proud." George watched her, feeling grateful. He smiled back for the first time in a long time. "He was my inspiration," said George, "and always will be."